Yeah, so thanks. It's great to be back. So yeah, I recently made a job change, and this talk that I'm going to present today is actually one that I prepared for the Pixelotl conference in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And Pixelotl is interesting, right? It came at an interesting time for me because it was like right around the time that I was going to be making this transition and kind of figuring out what my new role at my new job, my new studio was going to be like. And it's also not really a game dev conference. Pixelotl is about film and animation primarily, and they're getting more and more game content as they go over the years. So it's sort of a chance for me to step outside of myself and my situation and speak about my thought processes and how we go about telling stories in games from sort of a different perspective for a different audience. So that said, I hope this will be interesting and useful for you. But before we get too far into it, yeah. So yeah, Ron already gave me a nice introduction, so this will be fast. I went to UCF, and then I graduated. I went to Terminal Reality, which is a boutique studio in Dallas, Texas, which actually closed just about a year ago. I worked on Blood Rain 2. I worked on the Aeon Flux adaptation for the Charlize Theron movie. In a bizarre twist of fate, for about 10 minutes, I worked on the Grandma's Boy stoner comedy while there. So that was weird. And then in 2005, I got a job at Bethesda Game Studios in Maryland, where I worked on Oblivion, Fallout 3, Skyrim, and Fallout 4. But as mentioned, this past year, in June, I made a change, and I went up into Canada to join Ubisoft Toronto. And I went to Ubisoft for this new role of World Director. And if you think that's vague, you're like, me too. Nobody really knows, within Ubisoft, exactly what this job title means. And for those of us who are the world directors throughout the company, it's sort of an opportunity to look hard at the place that we're building. But still, the job is so grandiose. I actually am a little embarrassed every time I have to tell somebody my job title. And it's so sort of sweeping and big, and it could mean anything. And so for me, as I approach this job, I have to think about how I can boil it down into some key things that I know that I care about. And a lot of that comes down to world building. There's a lot to do with player exploration and pacing and game design, but world building specifically is something I kind of found interesting to make a focal point of a job. Because in game development, when we talk about world building, we often think of it as the literal act of creating the play space. Sculpting terrain and putting down trees and villages and roads, and we fixate on the physical notion of world building. A lot of studios will use this term specifically to refer to environment art or level design. But if you're talking to filmmakers, screenwriters, novelists, playwrights, world building means something else. It's not just creating a physical space, but having a space that has internal consistency, that has cohesive elements that work together as a whole to create a credible and believable setting for your worlds and your stories to take place in. When we talk about world building, a lot of the conversation goes back to J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien, of course, is the writer of Lord of the Rings, creator of Middle-earth, and Tolkien used to refer to his approach as mythopia. Now, Tolkien used a lot of fancy words to talk about his approach to his work, but I've always liked mythopia. It comes from the Greek, literally means myth-making, and he wrote a poem. So he was in a debate with C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis was of the opinion that myths were sort of beautifully told lies, and Tolkien took issue with that, and he sort of did the most sort of, rap battle thing that Tolkien could do. He wrote a 3-page poem about it called Mythopia. And Tolkien's general opinion was myths were ways that we dealt with reality. Myths are ways that we could tell truths and take these things, these concepts that can be difficult to understand, and bring them down to earth with larger-than-life characters that are still relatable and interconnected. And I think he was onto something, right? We see this repeated in different cultures throughout the globe of using myths to tell stories and relate our histories and our cultures and the facts of the world around us. We see this time and time again. And Tolkien isn't the only one to use this myth-making in this sort of interconnected setting to create stories. T.S. Eliot specifically, author of The Once and Future King, specifically used the term mythopia when talking about his approach to building worlds. Many folks are familiar with H.P. Lovecraft and Cthulhu mythos, which again is an interconnected pantheon of these eldritch gods that are all interconnected and tell different stories that relate to the eldritch in one form or another. J.K. Rowling, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, of course, modern readers are going to be familiar with. And then the current king of the fantasy promise, George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series. And of course, when we're looking at Martin and Rowling and we're looking at Tolkien, we know that this isn't just stuff for fantasy novelists, that this translates to the mainstream screen. These are some of the biggest IP franchises when it comes to the film these days. And it's not just fantasy stuff either. Like the Marvel universe, 30 years ago was like far too geeky and weird and out there to consider being like a mainstream blockbuster media powerhouse, but it is, right? Like everyone's family has seen some of these things and sees the recurring characters and threads this world that's larger than any of the individual stories that are told from any individual piece of work within it. And again, this is still kind of like in the geek culture sphere, but you take something like Law and Order. Law and Order has its own continuity, it has its own universe, it has its own internal rules, and we have all these different spin-offs that run across the globe and run across different generations and settings. And even though Law and Order is a reflection of our world, it is in fact its own world being built around Law and Order's mythology. So these worlds, being built as these fictional sort of settings, these tapestries that we can pull our stories and our actions from, is pretty well established. Just we in games don't really talk about it with the same language. And I think that we can learn some things by talking in the same language. But we also have to understand that we are our own medium, and the rules are a little bit different for us, and we have different opportunities and different challenges. And so for me, I want to try and talk about and help understand how it's used in those other mediums. Because if we're writing a novel or if we're doing a screenplay, we use world building as a tool, right? Like as a writer or as a creator, we create this world, we can come up with these rules, and then from that, we weave the story. And that story is, of course, what the reader will consume. And if we go back to that world and we tell multiple stories in that same setting, the reader will begin to build their own sort of mental map of that world, but it's always through the proxy of the stories that are told with it. So we want to build the worlds, and I think many of the ways that we build the worlds are the same, but how we share them can be different. So let me return back to the talk. Now, I mentioned that this is a talk that came at a transition period. If you ever get in the situation where you start giving talks, here's what happens. Somebody asks you, will you do a talk? It's 6 months away. You come up with a title that you think you can write a talk about. So this really isn't what this talk is. This talk is my grab bag of tips and thoughts about how we can use world building to tell stories in games. That's really what this talk boils down to. So we're going to kind of go all over the place. We're going to talk about specific techniques. We're going to talk about high-level concepts. I hope you'll learn something, and if not, I hope you'll at least be entertained. So let's just get into them. So the first tip. Think about the perspective of the world, of the stories that you're going to tell. What is the purpose? What is the viewpoint that you're going to give the player? What's their lens into the world? And what can you say with that? And to do this, I'm going to give 3 examples from games that you'll probably be familiar with. First one being BioShock. So BioShock takes place in the underwater city of Rapture, which is the brainchild of this character, Andrew Ryan. Andrew Ryan, of course, has got the big Ayn Randian ideas about sort of libertarianism and self-dependence and self-reliance and freedom from the trappings of the lower class. Now, when you're exploring Rapture and you're learning about the setting and Andrew Ryan, you're going to do so through playing through the levels. Each of the levels in BioShock has its own sort of story arc, its own reason for existing within the world of Rapture, and you get its own characters, and it has a sort of self-contained personality. And we learn about that through environmental storytelling, through audio diaries for encounters with the characters and the creatures that are in those specific levels. And then we also have some things that transcend the levels as a construct. So like the little sisters and the big daddies. There's a ton of world building baked into those characters, how they look, how they behave, the rules that deal with how you interact with them. And when you start investigating their stories, you get into like this Dr. Tenenbaum character. Now the thing about the perspective of BioShock is all these elements that you interact with in the world, they all point back to Andrew Ryan. BioShock is really about him and his ideologies and his philosophies and how that guy's mental outlook created this setting in the rise and the fall of Rapture. And it gives BioShock this sort of cinematic, character-driven quality that comes out of the way the world building is exposed to the player. So we'll compare that with Skyrim. Again, Skyrim takes place in Skyrim, and it has a main story thread, right? The 2 main things that are central to the core storyline are the Civil War, the big political battle happening between the Empire and the natives. And then you have the Return of the Dragons, which happens kind of during the first act of that storyline. Now, if you're to play Skyrim and you want to just explore the Civil War and the Return of the Dragons, you're going to be hard-pressed to do so because there are all these distractions littered around the world. You're going to find all of the levels or the dungeons that all have their own self-contained stories and their own characters and their own books and notes. You'll find the quest lines, which tend to have their own story progressions. They're self-contained again. There are some glancing interactions between these storylines, but they tend to be pretty self-contained and stand on their own. We have our more one-off things like the Pantheon quests for the Daedra and the Aedra, the gods and demons of the world, that have their storylines, again, self-contained and part of the overall mythology of religion in that world. And then we have all the random sort of books and encounters with people and dialogue that all happen in the world. And the thing with Skyrim, it's kind of the opposite of BioShock, because all of these elements in the world building are really meant to push back to the world of Skyrim, right? You're always sort of being redeposited, and the layers of believability on that world are sort of caked on over time. So if you steep yourself into Skyrim, you just get more and more immersed into Skyrim. But it's not got the focus of something like BioShock, where you're learning about a very specific sort of ideology and character. So the last example I'll use for the perspective point is GTA. So GTA 5 setting is Los Santos. In GTA 5, you play through this world as any and all of these three protagonists. Each of these guys has his own series of quests and missions that he can go on that are specific to himself, but they also have the heists, which are these bigger quests that require everybody to kind of work together, and they're the big set pieces. And then, of course, we have our random stuff, our radio stations and character dialogue and side missions that all sort of help build out the world building. Now, the thing with GTA is everything in the world has an analog. Los Santos really stands for all of Southern California and the culture and the look and the different regions that you would expect to see around there. Each of the characters represents a different facet of American crime. And the side content tends to have its own thematic things, right? This is obviously the Lindsay Lohan celebrity mission. This is obviously the mission that's about federal corruption, or you have the Juggalos stuff that goes into the Trevor storyline. It's very satirical of American culture. And it gives us this different vibe, right? Where Skyrim immerses you in this world and tries to let you sort of forget that other places exist. With GTA, you're always very conscious of your own reality, because it's sort of you and the game creators are sort of elbowing each other and pointing and laughing at different things that you recognize from your own reality. And the world building is drawn from our world and given this satirical sort of parody outlook that influences how we feel about it. And these are all three games that I think have good world building, but they just do very different things with that world building. So when you do your homework and you have all of this information about how the world should work, you can still present very different game experiences to players, and they all will feel credible and well realized in their own way. So moving down then, I want to talk for a little bit about language, right? Because when we think about stories and sharing stories that come from these worlds, we're all very used to the oral tradition of storytelling with language. Most of us really first learned about the concept of storytelling in a grandparent's kitchen or around a campfire. This is part of who we are as people. So there are a number of things to keep in mind when we're using language to tell our stories. And the first one is to be succinct. So let's imagine you're playing a role-playing game and you come across a strange character. And you talk to the character, there's a dialogue system, and they say some things about their family or their village or this quest they want to go on, and they just go on and go on and go on. And your eyes kind of glaze over, you're not really paying attention, you're sort of clicking through. It's what we call the lore dump. So lore dumps are any time, in RPGs we talk about them a lot because RPGs commit the sin the most. But it's we've just fallen so in love with telling you all this stuff that you're just not paying attention anymore. And the interesting thing about lore dumps is they usually point to a symptom of a different cause. And it's either that the writing itself is weak and could use some editing, or that the writer could build their chops, or that the thing the writer is trying to communicate is actually overly convoluted and complicated, and we're trying to sort of patch an issue with the underlying narrative or the impetus of a mission or a quest with a bunch of verbal justification that is probably not actually going to work. Now, when it comes to being a stronger writer, there's tons of help out there. All you have to do is look at traditional writing. One of the most famous handbooks for writing in the English language is Strunk & White's Elements of Style. And when it comes to being succinct, which I think games particularly need to be succinct, they say it very simply: vigorous writing is concise. Shakespeare said it his own way: brevity is the soul of wit. And in general, when you talk to trained writers, anybody realizes that kind of any hack can put together 50,000 words, right? But it takes a little more skill to tell the same story in 50 sentences or 5 sentences or 1 sentence. That's difficult to do. And you have to work at it, right? It's not something you get for free, and you can learn from writers and other mediums to better deploy words when you're going to use them to tell your stories in games. Now, when it comes to things that are covering for convoluted or overly complicated situations, it's good to keep this piece of advice in mind. This is from the novelist Elmore Leonard. If ever somebody wrote a piece of advice for novel writers that actually was better for game developers, like, this might be it. Like, in games, we have, as players, an unprecedented expectation of skipping the stuff we don't care about, right? Like, in movies and books, you don't really, like, skip a cutscene the way you will in a game. And if you're creating something, if you're writing circles around something that you can observe or you kind of expect players are going to skip anyway, it's a good indication that maybe you can find other ways to tell your story and other ways to communicate information to the player or fix the underlying problems that are putting you into this weird situation in the first place. All right, moving along. When you are talking about your world, don't provide all the answers. So in Star Wars, there are a number of these really great moments where the characters on screen refer to something that is beyond our understanding as viewers. Han Solo brags about the Kessel Run. Mon Mothma tells us that Bothan's spies died for this information. What's so effective about this is these characters are immersed in their own setting. They don't know there's a camera on them. They don't know that you don't know what a Bothan is. But you don't have to. And they don't have any reason to stop and explain themselves. That tends to break this spell, and you'll see a lot of fantasy and sci-fi where they kind of break the spell by explaining something like this to you. But you don't need to know what a Bothan is to understand the concept of sacrifice. You don't have to know what the Kessel Run is or what a parsec is to understand the idea of braggadocio and the fact that this guy is trying to impress somebody. What's great about this is for the curious in the audience, you're going to make them wonder. Right? It's going to give this credibility that this world exists beyond the piece of media that you're consuming, right? Like, Bothans aren't really dealt with. Like, I'm kind of sad that Rogue One is going to deal with Bothans. Like, I heard that, on the internet, so it's probably true. Like, it's just, this world is bigger than you. It's bigger than this story. And it makes you wonder, well, what else is out there? Like, what is a Bothan? What other kinds of organizations and creatures might there be? And it brings the curiosity of the viewer into the experience. And it lets you use their imagination to make something greater than you as a creator could make by yourself. It's the same trick that's used by carnivals and festivals for years and into this day. When you walk by a fence and you can feel the vibrations in the ground and you can hear the music, you can see the colored lights, but when you look through the fence, you just see these fragments and these glimpses of what might be on the other side. And the festival in your imagination is sometimes going to be better and greater than the festival that is actually on the other side of the fence. And the people creating the festival know this, and they know that they can just incite your curiosity and get you to imagine this thing that is so wonderful, so great, that you want to be true, that you'll come and you'll find out and you'll participate. Also, try to let your world speak for itself. So this is David Attenborough. If you've ever listened to like BBC Earth, you're familiar with Attenborough. He's a famous nature documentarian, narrator. And one of the reasons why Attenborough is so good at his job is he has a way of capturing the wonder we feel when seeing all the splendor of, a baby rhinoceros tramping across the savannah. But he also has the information. He's spoken to the scientists, and he conveys a certain sense of knowledgeable authority and can tell us what's going on in a way that's, beyond what we would understand as a layperson watching the same footage. And that's great for planet Earth. But when it comes to a fantasy setting where we want players' imaginations to come into the case, this kind of information actually shrinks the reality of the world. It eliminates our ability to be curious and the ability to make our own stories because we've been given the authority. And when we say something as a game developer, we tend to be trusted, right? If something is in the manual or on the site or in like a dev diary, that's the reason that thing is because a game developer told you, and after all, the game developer is a creator. But if you use the voices of characters in your world, they are fallible, they are unreliable narrators, and they can then be part of the story themselves. For example, in Moby Dick, Herman Melville doesn't write in the voice of Herman Melville, the author. He uses his character Ishmael. All right, very first line of the book is "Call me Ishmael." And we are with Ishmael throughout this entire journey of this novel. And instead of just getting the facts of what happens in the course of Moby Dick, we get to see the world through the biases and the prejudices and the preconceived notions that Ishmael has in himself, right? He becomes part of the world for us. And we begin to see how he colors his experience, how he might misrepresent or misunderstand things that we think there's more to it than. And it makes Moby Dick a more successful story overall than if it was just written as a documentary. So in the Elder Scrolls, we were pretty conscious of this. And there's one reason why there's very little in the way of like sort of omnipotent third-person text in the Elder Scrolls. And in general, all the mysteries in the world were kept as mysteries, and when we commented on them, we used unreliable narrators. Mike the Liar is a recurring character who would comment on things like, why are the dragons back? Where were the dragons at? And he'll just tell you a ridiculous lie that you know is obviously untrue. We would write like academic papers about big things in the history of the world, and we would deliberately have one college write this one paper and another college write this other paper that were completely in conflict with each other to make the world feel more credible, like people had their own opinions and their own prejudices, their own biases. You know, one of the big mysteries of the Elder Scrolls is like, where did the dwarven people go? I can wear their armor, I can find their dungeons, but there are none around. And like, I could tell you, but where's the fun in that? Like, it's better as a mystery. So something else you can do also, because like a few of these examples I fixated on, you know, like dialogue writing, but we don't always have to use dialogue when we want to use language to communicate about our world. There are a lot of different ways that we can embed writing into the environment or into the world, into the soundscape of the game. And we could talk about good usage and best practices for all of these in a bit of detail. But for today, since we're kind of going high level, we're just going to talk about graffiti. So this is from Dead Space, you know, survival horror game set on a derelict space station. You have these sort of zombie guys running around, and one of the big game mechanics is that you have this weapon, the plasma cutter, and it shoots this broad effective damage, and it cuts limbs off so the bad guys can get crippled and limbs taken off, and that's a big part of how you play the game. So at one point early in the game, you come across this piece of graffiti. Cut off their limbs. Well, thank you. That is useful to know. That is how you play the game. This is a sort of thing where you can almost imagine the design meeting. We're like, hey guys, we got the playtest feedback. 40% of people aren't getting it. We got to figure out a way to let people know that they have to cut off the limbs of the enemies. And so we'll put up this, and by the way, that poster back there, that's actually like a diagram of the thing he's holding in his hand, and it says cut off their limbs, and there's kind of a corpse here, but like, who wrote that? And why? Like, did this guy think it was like critical he used his last pint of blood to crawl up on a table and like make sure he framed it in that light? Just like, it just feels really artificial. And it doesn't use the opportunity to tell you anything about the world. Like, it's telling you about a game mechanic, and it is useful. And I applaud that they're trying to do it outside of like a tutorial and like keeping you in the experience. But this is so contrived that it not only fails to tell anything about the world, but actually like it breaks the spell. And you feel that you're being pandered to by the game designer to help you understand the mechanics. So here's a better example from sort of a similar zombie-ish, survival horror-ish kind of game, Left 4 Dead. Now, if you're not familiar with Left 4 Dead, it's a zombie game, multiplayer, and at the end of each level, and there's sort of 4 levels in a story arc, you'll come to these safe rooms. And the safe rooms are always like sort of a hardened location, a basement or a concrete building where people can get together and like sleep through the night in safety. And that's exactly how the characters use it. You get to the end of the level, you all get together in this one place, there's some ammunition, some health, you get together and everybody survived or hasn't, and you go on to the next level. And what's really great about the safe rooms and the safe room graffiti is the players and the world are using the location for the exact same purpose. There is no dissonance to worry about there. So then this graffiti that you find on the wall serves to fulfill that idea in your head of how these spaces are used. And there's a little bit of gameplay information on these things. Like this one talks a little bit about like whether or not they can communicate the virus like through an airborne way, which doesn't matter very much, or you have like the idea that they can talk, and sure enough, if you listen, you can hear some words. But what it's doing a better job of is putting these little fragments of human stories onto the wall and telling you a little bit about not just the setting's like rules, but telling you a little bit about how the setting affects people and how the overall fiction of the world is cohesive and you're part of it and it invites you in. And I think overall that makes this really effective in terms of world building, even if it's not necessarily communicating like game mechanic tutorial information to you in flashing red lights. Okay. Something else to keep in mind is the notion of restraint. Like, part of what games are known for, and what's great about a lot of games, is like big, over-the-top, bombastic, and like communicating in a really loud voice. And sometimes as game developers, that translates to how we tell our stories, and we maybe can be a little bit over the top or tell a little bit too much. So this is Tom Bissell. Tom is a prolific writer. He was like published in Harper's at the age of, I think, 18. He's written several novels. He's attached to some screenwriting projects, but he's also a really big fan and proponent of video games. Tom's written a few books that deal specifically with games. He's written a lot of criticism, and he's also done writing for games like Uncharted, Battlefield Hardline, the Gears of War franchise. Tom is a writer and a man that I have a lot of respect for in how he thinks about things. So after we shipped Skyrim when I was still at Bethesda, about a month after the game came out, Tom wrote a piece. And it wasn't a review, it was like a think piece, a long editorial thing. And it was fairly critical. He's a big fan of the series, but he's having struggles like appreciating the storytelling, and maybe, it's a great piece, but he's have I changed or has it changed or la la la. Specifically, he makes a lot of comparisons between the storytelling in Skyrim and the storytelling in something like Dark Souls. And specifically, when talking about the Souls games, Tom says a couple of things, and I'll just sort of read the quote, but the capital S storytelling in Demon Souls and Dark Souls has been restrained to the point of apparent and only apparent non-existence. So when you play a Souls game, there aren't books laying around, there's not a lot of dialogue. When characters speak to you, they're super unreliable, and they're sort of weird, and they speak in riddles, and half of it probably doesn't actually mean anything, but then the other half, maybe it does, and you're not sure which is which. So there's not a lot of like storytelling, like the capital S storytelling in terms of like, here are the 500,000 lines of dialogue we recorded, here are the 40 in-game books, and here are the the history sections that you can go into a UI. It's all baked into the world. And so Tom goes on to say, the primal vessels for storytelling are the environments and the player's experience within those environments. So all of the little elements and the ways, like the creatures that are in the levels and the little crucifixes and monuments and the geography, like these all come together and are very consistent, but the game doesn't feel obliged to explain to you what that crucifix means or why it's shaped that way or how that certain monster became what it is. That's all there for you to imagine, for you to speculate on. It's one of the things that has made the Souls games capture the imagination of the community that has been built around it. So we need to learn to hold back. Our stories can be more effective. But to be honest, maybe give up. We aren't in control. The players are in control. Like anybody who studies film knows the power of the camera. If you're a filmmaker, like choosing the lens and framing the shot and getting the lighting correct and then editing the footage down, like these are extremely powerful tools that can make the difference between like a good film, a great film, and absolute trash, right? With like the same base script. And when we are making games, we like in almost every game, we literally give the camera away and the player's in total control of it. And so like, how can we even use these techniques that work so well in other mediums? Like maybe we just take a step back and like, it's just the player's thing and there's only so much we can do, so maybe don't try so hard. So this is Sleep No More. Sleep No More is a theatrical production. It's run in a few cities. Right now it's in New York City. It's been there for a while. Now, Sleep No More is really innovative because of its format. Now, it's not a Broadway musical where you're going to go and you're going to be seated in an auditorium and you're going to see a play and take an intermission and come back and see, the third act. In Sleep No More, it takes place inside 5 floors of a converted industrial space in central Manhattan. And throughout those 5 floors, there are a series of interconnected rooms that have all been dressed up into different sets. When you go to Sleep No More as a viewer, you're given a mask. So everybody wearing a mask here is actually a member of the audience. And you're encouraged to be curious and to explore and to take things at the pace that you wish. And when you're in that environment, there are actors, and it's not like improvisational, it's highly choreographed, that are going through different scenes and playing out their scenes And so in this particular shot, we have a few people who've gathered around this woman. She's playing a scene, and she might be playing opposite somebody who's off frame. And you have a decision to make as the viewer, because she will finish her scene, and she will get up and she will go. And the man she's playing against will get up and go, or maybe he'll stay here another 10 minutes and do another scene by himself, or somebody else will wander in. And so what are you going to do? Do you go with her? Do you want to know more about her story? Or do you go with the guy? See who else shows up, see where he wanders off to? Maybe you don't do any of that, and you just stay in this room and you go through that suitcase and you see what's inside of it and start reading journals or looking at people's garments. You're allowed to do that. That's what makes Sleep No More really, like, it's really captured the imagination. You have like Sleep No More people who go back and back and back and experience multiple times. And it's really like sort of was a big deal in the theater community when it hit. And part of what makes it so big is the lengths it goes through with high production value to subvert the genre that it's in, right? Like by inviting the audience to come into the set and to interact with the set and to, you know, like really get in the face of the actors and observe their performance at any angle that you want. That was something that theater goers in New York hadn't really seen, they didn't really understand. When I did Sleep No More, I couldn't believe that I just got to play a live action BioShock, right? Like, there's nothing more video game in the real world than Sleep No More, at least not that I've done. And that's the thing, in games, this is free. We don't have to subvert our genre to get interactivity. That's the thing that makes us special. And I think sometimes when we're really fixated on storytelling, those of us who love telling stories, we can lose sight of that. So yes, we have to give up control of certain things, and we can't use certain techniques that work in other media. But there are things that we can do that others can't. So we have to start thinking a little bit differently about techniques. And remember that we haven't been around that long as an art form, right? Like, we are still going to be the old generation when this gets to like where film is now. And there's a lot of pioneering to be done. And so for me, in this point of view that I'm taking, you know, as I explore this talk and this job that I'm in, is how we use world building differently. Because it's not a tool that we use to create stories. It can be, but it's actually the product itself, right? Our players get to experience it firsthand. They don't have to engage with our stories if they don't want. They can just go into the world and see it for themselves. And it's not a tertiary mental model of the world that you have in your head. You are there. You are a primary agent within that space. And you can create your own stories from that world through the experiences you have, through the decisions that you make and the actions that you take. All right. So I'm going to come down off the mountain a little bit because I want to talk about imagery. Because so far, like I've talked mostly been like the specific stuff about language and words and dialogue and writing, but images are a big deal for us in terms of how we can tell stories, particularly if you're a level designer or an artist creating things. Because video games are, with very, very few exceptions, visual, right? Highly visual. The games that tend to capture our imaginations the most are often the ones that have the most provocative visuals or the most lavish visuals or somewhere in between or both. And it makes sense. Like, our history as a culture starts with cave paintings, our earliest stories told on walls, and that we may not know how these people spoke to each other, but we know how they communicated and what their circumstances were because of these images. Many of the earliest alphabets were pictographic. I mean, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Egyptian hieroglyphic systems, and the pictorial origins of many languages are still seen in the character sets today, like kanji. Through the many generations of huge religions trying to communicate their stories to a largely illiterate population, the image was frequently used in frescoes and tapestries, paintings, and stained glass to communicate and provide reference point in a way that anyone in the community could understand, and not just the tiny fraction who had the privilege of the ability to read. Artists like Pablo Picasso can capture something like the bombing in the Spanish town of Guernica, and not just document that it happened, but tell us how it affected the world through the lens of his experience and his perception from his background, and make us as a culture remember Guernica longer than we might otherwise do. Modern masters of this, for me, are photojournalists. When we see this image, we don't know the names of these children. We have maybe a vague idea of where in the world they are, but the truth of their circumstance, their story, in an instant, no problem. We all understand. And it's more impactful, more instantly than the story that would have gone along with this piece. Same is true here. It's not staged. It's not framed. This is just a moment of truth caught on film. And every element in there tells us a story about the kinds of people we're looking at, the kinds of circumstances that they're in, and the reality of the situation where they are in the world right now. And this will affect you in a different way fundamentally than the written word that goes along with it. So for me, the power and the precedence of using imagery, it's, without question, right? So when we think about using imagery to tell stories in games, the term that will come up over and over again is environmental storytelling. It's a really popular topic with level designers and environment artists. And a lot of game developers are paying more and more attention to making this part of their process these days. Now, environmental storytelling is a big topic. And it's a big topic because when I think it works, it makes us feel like archaeologists, right? We've been pushed into this world that we don't fully understand, that has its own set of rules. Even if it's a version of the world we know, we're still strangers visiting there. And we get to interact directly and start to look at the artifacts of these people and interact with their culture and understand the setting that they're in. And environmental storytelling is a big part of making this consistent and appealing and a temptation to draw us into the setting and the fiction. So for this, purposes of this, I'm breaking environmental storytelling down into two really broad categories. And one is detail-focused events, and ones that are more about the historic detail of a space or a setting that we're in. And we'll begin with the event detail stuff, because event storytelling is really a story where there's a beginning and a middle that we don't get to see. We just get the end. You can't look at that image and not try to figure out how a glitter bomb and a toilet ended up in the same place. And that's the thing. That's how it works, is you see the conclusion of the story and you just wonder about what happened here. I'll go from this, but I'll keep the bathroom theme to another. So this is from Last of Us. And Last of Us, again, is a post-apocalyptic, survival, semi-horror type of game. You play as the very well-named protagonist and his sidekick Ellie. And you're going through this world, and every day is hell, right? You go through the different settings, the different levels of the game, and it's bleak and oppressive consistently throughout. And when we come across this story, right, where we just see this bathtub of blood, and these two people and this mutual suicide, on the surface it can just feel like it's sort of on tone, like it's macabre and sort of gross, and it makes us uncomfortable. But there's a little more built into this, because if you think about Joel and Ellie and their mind space, when they see something like this isn't a reminder of their own mortality. This is a reminder that this is an option. Every day they make the decision not to take the easy way out. And they press on. And that's the impetus that drives the players as well, to survive and explore and to get to the other end of things. And this piece of environmental storytelling is actually really, really ingrained into their individual character arcs, their stories, and their motivations in this world. So this time I'll dump the bathroom, but I will go to more skeletons. This is from Fallout 4. And this is kind of the opposite, right? This story is not about the nuclear conflict. This story is not about retrofuturism or 1950s cultural identity. This is just a couple of people murdering each other on top of a safe. And maybe the bomb blast killed them, or maybe this happened, 10 years ago and not 200 years ago. We don't really know. And this goes back to some stuff I was saying earlier. This is an event that has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with the game. It is just the world. This is a thing that happened in the setting, and you come across it, and it reminds you this world is bigger than yourself, and it's bigger than the themes. It's just a moment of life or death that was captured for you to discover, and it makes the world feel more bespoke and broader than it would otherwise. Of course, when it came to these corpse stories, we maybe had a little too much fun. So Ben Esposito is an indie game developer, and earlier this year he was teasing sort of the Bethesda mode of environmental storytelling on Twitter. And the thing is, this is if you're into Twitter, this is a fun, I think Ken Levine got really mad. So the thing is, Ben wasn't just being a wise ass, right? Like, I talked to Ben about this because he's a smart guy and is curious, and he said, yeah, he's being cheeky and he's having fun, but for him, like, he finds it frustrating how reductive, like, the concept of environmental storytelling often gets reduced to like 2 dead bodies in bed holding hands, right? Like, that's sort of the classic, like, I've done that, like, just 2 skeletons holding hands. It's sad. This thing happened. And environmental storytelling is more than that, right? It can be more than just these like little snapshots that sort of tug at a heartstring or remind us of a setting. So this is a screenshot from Ben's game, Donut County. And there is no like event detail environmental storytelling here. Like, I'm not super intrigued by why that donut's on the floor. Like, the what happened here isn't really here. But what is here are choices, right? Like, Ben has made a very deliberate set of choices. There's not a lot of detail here, but we know a little bit about her hairstyle, her clothing, the like banana board she's got, and we learn a little bit about the world, like the weird little raccoon buddy and the color choices that Ben's made tell us about the tone that we can expect if we choose to play Ben's game. And so we get this environmental storytelling that's more of like a character portrait. And again, it's one of these things that I feel like people working in theater know very well, right? Like, the choice of costume, like, every one of you is wearing a story, right? Like, what you chose to put on your body tells us about how you want to represent yourself, where you come from, your background. It's a character portrait. It's not like a beginning, middle, end story, but it is still story. It is still part of the world building. And that gets more into what I consider like the historic details, right? The internal consistency that makes the world feel consistent and makes the world feel credible. Like, when we see this photograph, like, I believe this is in Sri Lanka. Like, we don't know necessarily who built this. We don't know why they built it in the format that they did, like what the partie of this thing was before it was partially destroyed, what's at the top, what purpose did it serve, but maybe we're curious. And even if we're not curious and we go into the village and we see these similar like motifs, the culture will feel consistent. You don't even have to be paying attention to pick up on those kinds of details if you spend time in a place which has been thoughtfully constructed. So this is a screenshot from indie game Gone Home. Now, if you're not familiar, Gone Home is a game where you are playing a girl who was away, sort of backpacking across Europe, after college, I believe, and she comes home. Her family, while she was away, moved into a new home that they had inherited in their town. And when you get home from the airport, nobody's home. Your parents are gone, your teenage sister is gone, and you get to explore the house, and you learn about what's happened in the year that you were away. You learn about the family that presumably you already know. I mean, maybe you learn things about your family you didn't know. And you also learn about this house, like this weird house that you inherited from some uncle, and like, what is that all about? And so this image has sort of both kinds, like multiple layers of environmental story baked into it. Like, when it comes to the event, right, we have the dirty pizza box, and there's like a board game or a book under that cushion there, like sort of a couch fort thing, and the soda cans and the notes. Like, okay, there was a slumber party or something. She was hanging out with her friend, and this just looks like a teenager was hanging out in the evening there. So we have like what was happening in the past like 8 hours or 24 hours that was sort of left without being cleaned up. But then all the details around, they also have meaning as well. The furniture is furniture that your family brought in, that you moved, like you do. And so all this furniture is trying to be consistent with the decisions that a family, like a 90s family would make, stuff that they brought with them, stuff from kind of different time periods, but still kind of contemporary within their generation. Carla Zamonja, the art director for this game, she has this really wonderful artifact. It's like a 1988 Sears catalog full of like really, really tacky choices. And she like used that as her design Bible for like the types of things she would choose. So like that couch or that end table are very specific things that just feel like stuff that's from the 90s or stuff that you had around from the 80s that your family kept in the house for years. And then of course the house is from a different time period entirely. It wasn't occupied by your family until recently. They've moved in, so the wall coverings and the light fixtures, they're from a different era, from a different person who made the decisions to include those. And you get all these layers that are thoughtfully informed and make this space feel extremely focused. One of the things that's interesting about this game is Steve and Carla, the devs who sort of began the project, and Yanaman as well, they all had worked on BioShock games. And when they went indie, they were like, well, what if we did a BioShock game that just had none of the video game in it? We just did like the setting and the storytelling and the world building, and that was the entire game. And can that work? And if you've played Gone Home, I think it does. So yeah, environmental storytelling is a big topic. Most level designers, like yours truly, are going to be able to geek out about it for hours, so I won't. But if you want to, this is a GDC talk from a few years back, given by Harvey Smith and Matthias Vork. Both really intelligent designers who really know what they're talking about. Harvey, of course, is known for Deus Ex and Dishonored, both games that have really tremendous and well-known story building. Matthias is no slouch either. He just shipped Mafia 3, which of course has a really, really wonderful setting and really, really consistent. And so if you want to get like a good hour-long lecture, really solid stuff, you can find this online. Check out the slides of the video. By the way, I'll have links to all this stuff at the end, so you don't have to scramble. Okay, so moving along, I also want to talk a little bit about composition, all right, visual composition specifically. So say that maybe you've studied photography. You will know about things like the rule of thirds. Now, if you don't know about the rule of thirds, it's pretty easy. You take a photograph and you divide it into quadrants, or I don't know, septants. They're 9. So you divide it in these lines, and you want to align the most interesting elements of your image along these. Specifically, you want to go for these intersections. They're called points of power. And so in this image, we see that the man's leg and torso are like nicely stacked up on one of those lines. We have the sort of high contrast point of his beard and the headdress, the turban he's got on, like are all kind of around that point of power. It's also doing other things, like this is just a really solid photograph that's got motion in the legs and it's got nice pattern breaking. There's great contrast. Like all in all, this is a good photograph to talk about different compositional rules. And understanding these compositional rules can be really, really useful, again, particularly if you're an environment artist or a level designer and you're composing a space for players to go into. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might call BS. Because not 10 minutes ago, I told you to give up. I told you we don't have the camera. We can't use these techniques. And that's true, but we can still be informed by them, and we can still use them and apply them to our medium in the best ways we can, but only if you understand the principles, only if you understand the fundamentals to then try and find ways to apply them. So this is just a random image I grabbed of Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Of course, it's not a game I worked on. I don't know anybody who worked on it, so this is just me as an outside observer. Now, if we take this sort of battle arena area that has been set up inside of one of the island interiors in Black Flag, we can analyze it a bit. So yeah, it's sort of an arena. You kind of come in at one point, and there's an area where you're going to fight guys, and there's probably like another bottleneck where you'll exit the arena. Now that bottleneck is one of the first tools for a level designer to use, because when we create bottlenecks, we get a little bit more control over framing and vista reveals. So we have a narrow, and then we have a wide. We know that the FOV of the camera is a certain way. We know that the camera, the field of view of the camera is a certain way. We know that the camera is positioned, over the right shoulder or above. We know the perspective that our game generally supports. And so we can make good predictions about how the player will see the space and how it will come into view. Even if the player could technically be walking just looking at the ground, that's fine, right? We can't be precious about things, but for most players, they're going to get a framing like this. Their camera position might be different, but generally speaking, we know their viewpoint. Then, in terms of the composition of the positive elements or the filling elements of the space, we have these ruins. Now, these ruins create sort of a stage, and they're also placed. They're not perpendicular, right? We have a good angle, and that angle, working with vanishing point perspective, is going to create leading lines towards a focal point near the center of the frame. And those leading lines and that motion, again, remember, we're moving, so that's all going to be moving and creating motion. We then get to see these elements of contrast. And these guys, are moving, they're doing things. The red coats in particular are going to pop a little bit against the background. And it's going to draw the player's attention to the thing that they probably need to care about, the guys with the pointy sticks, right? Like, that's the thing that we want players to draw their attention to. They're probably going to notice the player or be milling around doing their own thing, so we get more motion in the environment. And we even get a little bit of the rule of thirds here. Like, as we come down the forest, we might have a vertical set, and then as we come out into the vista, we get this horizontal set where we kind of have the horizon line, and then we have the canopy, which is nicely backlit against the darker, more subdued Mayan ruins there in the center, and then, of course, the foliage in the ground plane. Now again, I don't know the level designer. I don't know if she made these choices intentionally or if it's just sort of like intuitive things. But you can still look at this sort of level design setup and see how it succeeds based on traditional visual compositional rules. Again, it's something that I'm not going to talk about in a ton of more detail, but this is it's a shorter talk given by Brendan Chung. Brendan is known, he shipped Quadrilateral Cowboy, which is the world's best hacking game, in terms of like, it really feels like hacking. That shit came out this year. He's also really well known for 30 Flights 11. Brendan is a film nut, and he specifically is really, really good at using film techniques in ways that game developers usually don't. So if you play like 30 Flights 11, which is like a very short game, there are a ton of really interesting techniques that he uses that other game developers don't. And in this talk, he kind of pulls back the curtain and specifically speaks to how those techniques can be applied to level design. All right. Now we're going to talk about Gestalt. Gestalt is a big topic. It gets into psychology and cognitive, chemistry. I'm not going to get into Gestalt in depth because I'd just be a total fraud. All we need to know for this discussion is this. Most of you have probably seen it. Two men facing each other or a candlestick. I'll use one that's a little bit less well known. There are no triangles on the screen. Your brain sees them, but they do not exist. We only have Pac-Man shapes and V's. That's it. Our brains can't handle incomplete patterns, right? We will see patterns everywhere. We don't like things that don't follow constructs, right? We make sense of things, and that's why we can't see those 3 points and not connect the lines and see the triangle in our mind's eye. It's why this works. This is a total non sequitur, but that's what makes it interesting because we can't see it and not try to figure out or make sense of our world by creating an artifice that makes this outcome make sense to us. Now, there's a broader point to be made here because it's not just about environmental storytelling and these kinds of things and non sequiturs. It's also about a larger point in terms of the techniques that we can choose to use when communicating story and imparting experiences into the minds of our players. Because when we get down to it, brain chemistry is pretty universal. If you work on games that are going to be international, and if you talk to game developers who've worked on things that are international, you'll find, this thing that was a really funny joke is super offensive in India, right? Or something that translates in German doesn't translate nearly the same way in the States, or German breaks formatting and you can't actually use the written word to tell the story because there is no word for that. Or even a visual iconography thing that you might do might not make cultural sense, from a Latin American culture into Russian culture, and something that's really important to your story is just going to go over the head of somebody who doesn't have that background. But when we're thinking about the ways that people process the world around them, that is going to be pretty universal. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's worth informing yourself of some of these fundamental techniques and finding ways that can inform your world building, whether you're world building in the biggest sense, or if you're just creating an environment or a space or writing a story or crafting even a game mechanic, that how people experience things from one culture to another are universal, can then be something that works for all audiences. All right, so Gestalt was way too big and academic of a concept, so let's go for another one. Emergence. Emergence is super interesting. I actually first discovered emergence not through games, but at UCF in a cognitive psychology class, and we were studying termite farms and the way people drive in traffic and how cops and traffic jams can affect how there are emergent behaviors. So emergence is super cool. I encourage you to geek out about it. But when we're talking about computers, John Conway is who we tend to come back to. John Conway was a British programmer, computer scientist in the 60s, came up with the game of life. The game of life, which there are 4 games of life running in this GIF, is basically a 2-dimensional simulation in which we create agents. And those agents tend to be very simple. Imagine 3 pixels that are sort of like a flapping bird, and it has rules. So that flapping bird is going to move 1 unit to the right every time that it flaps its wing. And if it collides with something, it's going to rotate itself 30 degrees and then continue doing its behavior. Now, those rules are very simple. It's a couple of lines of code. But when you put multiple agents into the simulation, they will interact, and those interactions will create unexpected patterns, or at least patterns that are super complex that couldn't be replicated without thousands of lines of code if you weren't using a systemic approach. So these are all just really, really dense Conway simulations where we see the game of life emerging into these different patterns that can be really interesting, surprising. And sometimes they're chaotic, and sometimes they emerge into sort of a greater, more organized shape. So that's like the classical computer science example. Let's talk about video games. So y'all have probably heard of Doom. Now, Doom was groundbreaking and super innovative for its time, still is. And most people, when they talk about how innovative Doom was, think about the first-person perspective and how they used it in the level design. But there's more to it than that. And a lot of it comes down to how they handled physics. So first we'll talk about rockets and explosions. Now, in Doom, they environmentally modeled this stuff. So if an explosion goes off, it doesn't just do damage and it doesn't just play a particle effect, but it actually creates a radius that applies a force outwards from its center. So if there's a bad guy standing near an explosion, he won't just die, but he'll get pushed. Now, if you've played a lot of Doom, you maybe didn't even notice it at the time, but in your mind's eye, you may recall like exploding barrel and imp. And when you blow up that barrel, the imp, like, he dies, but he also goes just like scooches over a tiny bit. And like that was actually the physics. Now, of course, we play any game, like not even AAA, like basically any game with explosions and ragdoll, we're going to see bodies flying all over the place. And it's the same principle, but Doom was really one of the first to model physics simulation into a game that a lot of people played. Now, they didn't just use the physics simulation for the rockets and the explosions, but also for the jumping mechanics. So let's say that you're going to go to your laptop and you're going to fire up Unity or GameMaker or something, and you're going to implement a simple jump in a game from scratch. The easiest way to do that is to write a piece of code. When the player presses the jump button, you're going to take the player's height, you're going to add 50 units or whatever, and then boom, you go up on the vertical and you've jumped. Now that's going to be a really quick and dirty way to get a jump in, but then you're going to have to handle collisions and slopes and angles and all these other things. But a much simpler, more elegant way to handle that jump is the way that Doom was doing it, which is not to just do a translation, but to apply a physical force. So it goes back to the physics tool bag, and it just says, instead of translating you, I'm just going to apply a force along your axis, and it's just going to push you. And because physical simulation is just a thing in the world, for example, if I'm in a room with a low ceiling, I will just hit it, and the physics simulation will handle that. A lot more elegant, a lot more efficient. So the game was made that way. The game goes out to the public, people start playing it, and players realize that they can combine these two things. Because if you can be above an explosion when it happens, those two forces become additive. And so now you go up twice. And it didn't expect that, right? Like players were able to jump out of areas that they really were supposed to be contained within. They could use techniques in multiplayer that they weren't really supposed to be able to. And that ended up being embraced. Like everybody who's like a first-person shooter geek knows about rocket jump, right? Like rocket jump is a ridiculous idea that an entire class in TF2 is built around. Like it makes no sense at all. Like nobody, whatever, at the Battle of Ardennes, like got over enemy lines by shooting a rocket at his foot, right? Like it's not a good idea. But in TF2, it's a whole thing. And it comes from the rocket jump that was, of course, it would later make it a big core component of games like Quake 3 Arena, where rocket jumping was an intentional tactic that levels were built for specifically. So Emergents can create these really interesting interactions that are really cool. And again, if those of us who are into simulation and programmers particularly like geek out about emergence, but there is a high correlation of emergence and the idea of emergence being unexpected. And in particular, the problem that comes out of this is for every diamond in the rough of an emergent behavior that's really cool, there might be dozens or hundreds of emergent behaviors, which are really just bugs, right? I mean, you could call the rocket jump a bug and you could fix the rocket jump. But that one was cool. But how many other things happened out of that simulation that were not cool and just resulted in the player like falling through the world? Like, so emergence it's a popular topic, and you'll find a lot of game devs talking about it and writing about it. But it's also a topic that is kind of met with some like guarded skepticism. It's like you don't just make a grab bag of things and just hope the best comes out of it, right? It's like it's not like the monkeys writing Shakespeare thing. You want to be calculated. So this is where I actually will bring this way back around and get back to storytelling and world building. Because it is possible to use intelligent emergent systems to create stories. And in order to explain that, I'll use Minecraft as an example. So y'all are probably familiar with game systems as a concept. You have a number of systems that are systems and mechanics that exist within the game, and those all are different things that can happen during the simulation. So the examples that I use here when we talk about Minecraft are explosions, fire, and AI. So some really simple rules of the world of Minecraft. One, we have fire propagation. Every little cube has a set of physical properties. One of those is flammable or not flammable. And the flame can spread from one element that is flammable to a neighboring element that is flammable. Again, it's pretty simple code. What we see here used to be a forest. And what the player did was the player just walked up to one tree, set the trunk on fire. Fire goes up the tree, spreads to the leaves. There are neighboring trees that have touching leaves, spreads across those, goes across the entire canopy, and now we're seeing the entire forest burning down from the top. We also have AI. So if you've played Minecraft, you know the creeper. It's a pretty simple enemy. AI just says, hello, and it just goes to somebody. That's all the creeper does. He just wanders, spots, and beelines. That's all he does. He also has another rule, which is exploding. So, hello, kaboom, right? That's all he does. He just gets close and he explodes, and sorry, that's how it goes. So, and you can do damage to him, and when he dies, he explodes. Like, he doesn't actually go up to him and say explode. He goes up to here and suicides, and the death is what makes the explosion. You also see too, like the rules of the world here, where all the little cube elements that get hit by the radius of the explosion get broken and converted into the collectible, the little pickups. And so those are all just systems that exist, and they're isolated from each other. Now, anybody who's played Minecraft has seen these systems come together. Like, if you've spent an appreciable amount of time, you have a version of the story where I was in the world and I built an underground hut, and it was like super cool, and like the wood looked really nice down there, and so I just like wanted to use wood. And a creeper came in because I forgot to close the door, and I wasn't looking, and I heard the tss, and he boom. And apparently there was a lava cave like 1 unit away, and it just flowed in, and everything caught on fire, and it was super sad, and I lost. Like, your version of that story was probably different than mine, but the systems were brought together in a way to create my version of that story. And your version of that story and your version of that story also intersected those same systems and brought them together. And so our stories are a little different, but they're also a lot the same. And this is like a fundamentally different sort of thing than having like game systems where, like, you know what, we were playing it and this really cool thing happened, and now I'm going to script a mission around that event because I want to make sure everybody experiences that event. Like, that's pretty typical. A lot of game developers will do that. But this is like a little bit of a lighter touch. Like, look, you don't engineer those systems, and it doesn't, it occurs to you what you're doing. Like, you can see how they're going to interact. And by just letting those systems exist and letting that propensity for the interaction exist, you can get these more organic outcomes than by crafting something that like exposes those interactions to the player explicitly. All right. So something else that kind of is run through this talk that I want to encourage everybody here to do is to be curious. One of the things that I was really glad that I went to a school like UCF for was I wasn't just in Ron's game engines class. I was in cognitive psychology, and I was in film history, and I was in web programming, and I did all these different things. And it forced me to learn things that sometimes I didn't really want to learn, but came back later to serve me in ways that I didn't always expect. And I've tried to do that in my life since and try to like reach outside. Like, if you're in this room, you're probably here because you really, really love games, and you probably got there because you really, really loved game culture. But what can be dangerous about that is existing entirely within that monoculture, right? Existing entirely within that sphere. And if you're only learning from your peers, and you're only learning from the art that you consume and the art that you create, like, everything becomes self-referential. And what games are is just going to narrow and narrow and narrow. And what's great right now is what games are is expanding, right? Like, we have more and more indie games and art games and VR games and mobile games and AAA games. And it's a really, really great time to play games. It's really, really great time to make games. And if you want to be part of expanding the meaning, the definition of what this art form can be, one of the ways you can do that is to be curious and to step outside of your comfort zone and learn new things, and then find ways to bring that fire back down the mountain and make games better for it. So a few things from my bookshelf that might be helpful to you, get you kind of in the mind frame. blah, blah, blah. I skipped a slide. All right, my bookshelf. So Christopher Alexander has been an author or co-author on a number of books that deal with how people use space and how spaces are built. One of my favorite anecdotes from the Oregon experiment is kind of like an example of emergence is, I think it was the University of Oregon. They were having a debate. They had built a new campus area, and they were arguing about like how to build the pavers and what surface they should be and where they should go and which buildings should have like the most direct routes. What they did was nothing. They just said, wait, just leave the lawn as it is, and then put the buildings down. And then they came back after a semester, and they just looked wherever the grass couldn't grow, and they've paved that. And they just let the students decide through emergence, right? You just have sort of flock behavior. People go in a way that would be very difficult to predict or to model or simulate. And if you get a bunch of people in a room who are arguing, they're just going to be guessing. Instead, you could just conduct the experiment. Let people do it. And then the evidence is right there. We're in Orlando, right? So we got to talk about Disney. This is a book by John Hench. He's one of the 6 old men of Disney. It's a super light book. Like you can buy this at downtown Disney for probably like 20 or 30 bucks. And like you might find it in the kids section. Like it is not a dense, this is a super academic book, right? Like this might be the bookstore on campus, that's at the park. But it's really, really packed with useful information. Like something that I think we take for granted, those of us who have grown up in a world where theme parks are just like a thing, don't realize that before the Disney parks, like the concept of themed spaces, it wasn't really a thing. Whereas now, like the drugstore that you go to is influenced by things that these guys had to figure out. And they were like the first ones. Like they were really familiar with film. How do we get the idea of a film experience to translate to moving through a park? But then how do we deal with people making their own choices and people going different places and families that have different interests? It's all in there, and it's super, super exciting, interesting stuff. This is actually, like, Disney concepts are really popular with game developers. Like, you've probably already talked about Cinderella's Castle and stuff like that. There's just a ton of information in there. Kludge, this book by Gary Marcus. Gary Marcus is one of these writers that can take, like, complex scientific concepts and make an entertaining book that anybody can read. It's not like a white paper. You don't have to be a cognitive psychologist to read this. It's specifically about evolution of our brains and how our brains evolve in kind of quirky ways. And there are things that we're really, really good at, like pattern recognition. And there are things that we can be really, really bad at, like noticing change. Right? They do an experiment at Harvard, I believe, where you sign up and you go like fill out a form and you go do a psychology test, and like the test has nothing to do with the experiment. What happens is like you come up, I give you paperwork. While you're filling it out, I bend down, and my friend gets up. And like 80% of people don't even know. Like our brains just can't deal with certain things. Kludge is really good for exposing some of that to you. A book that is really popular with game developers, Design of Everyday Things. So Donald Norman's book is about industrial design, and like affordance is a really popular term with game developers, and affordance comes from, well, it doesn't come from, but it's popularized by this book. The idea is that if I see a door, the door has a partie and it has an affordance, and I understand that like I push the thing to out the door. Like that's a really nice door. But then look at other doors around the building, you'll find doors that like you can't really tell if it's a push or a pull, or is it going to slide, or is it automatic, and like you won't look at doors the same if you read this book. and that image, that's from a French cartoonist who did a book of impossible things. That's called the Masochist Teapot. And that's the thing, is like there's an affordance to that. Like you can look at that image, you can understand why that's a stupid object. Like you can't pour the tea without scalding your hand. So yeah, Design of Everything is really good for understanding how people analyze the world around them and create expectations of how they can interact. Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, right? So Scott McCloud, finger guns over here. This guy's read it. So yeah, Scott McCloud talks, like you get some ideas of Gestalt here, like how you can use 3-panel format to get people to fill in the gaps of what happens between. And again, a lot to do with how people process images and how stories can come out of nonverbal technique. Anyway, those are just a few things. They're books that I'm excited about, so feel free. So okay, the last thing I want to talk about, and kind of bring this back to the idea of world building at large. Try and make it authentic. Like we're building worlds. Now these worlds might be real places, like it might be a version of Paris, right, or a version of your hometown. It might be a completely fantasy location. But whatever it is, if you can make it authentic, and sincere, that will read for players. Players will see the consistency in obvious and non-obvious ways, and it'll make the location feel more credible. It'll make the actions they can take feel more meaningful, and it'll invite them into the experience. It'll make them feel like they can go to this other place and they can have these experiences that might be difficult for them in the real world. Not necessarily for escapism, but for like a more focused place to bring their brain into a different way of thinking about things. You know, like Gone Home isn't an exotic location, but it is a focused location that puts you into a certain headspace and lets you have an experience that you might not have just wandering around a home in the real world. So if you can make your places authentic and consistent and treat them with respect, that respect will translate to the final experience of the player. All right, that's what I got. Blue stripes?
Would it be safe to say you're against cutscenes in general? And do you think it's because the industry's kind of moving away from that?
So, cutscenes. I'm a skipper. But it's selective. So I think cutscenes can be used really well. Where, like, I'll go back to the slide where, like, the lore dump and that can be used as a band-aid for deeper problems. I think a lot of cutscenes, that's what they are, right? Like, we can't capture the drama because we don't have this thing in the game, and we're going to show the player doing this crazy jump. But we as developers sometimes lose sight of the fact that as a player, you're like, why can't I do that crazy jump, right? And like that's what we want, like that's why we came to games. Now, I mean, the thing is, like, we're not moving away from cutscenes. We're just, I think, moving broader. Like, Uncharted 4 is still Uncharted 4. And for people who love Uncharted, part of it is that, right? Like, I've been playing Mafia 3. Mafia 3 has a really interesting, like, documentarian device for storytelling. And I'm a skipper, man, but I watch those things because they're interesting and compelling, and they feel super appropriate to the setting choices that it made. So, like, I'll buy into those, even though 80% of other cutscenes in other games, I will just mercilessly just not care and, like, just skip through. So I don't hate cutscenes. I don't think they're inappropriate. I just think that they should be deployed with precision and care and not as a quick fix. Red Plaid, you had your hand up first, I think.
So early on, you were talking about, are you referencing books like Moby Dick and like how their storytelling, like techniques they use? But then later on, you said that we can't really use techniques in other media. How do you balance that?
So it's not that you can't use them. It's just that you have to remember where you live, right, and find a different way to like hang that same photo. Like, so Melville's technique, right, the narrator. Call of Juarez is a super interesting, not that well-known game where there's a narrator in the game, and he'll narrate the things well, Bastion is super well-known, and Bastion also like has a narrator. It's not the Ishmael-style narrator, but it's still somebody who lives in the world and is commenting. And then that, like, you know, part of why Bastion was so exciting for so many people was like, oh, the narrator is responding to what I'm doing specifically. So I think it's a matter of like, think of what you love that is not represented well in games, either because it's not represented at all, or the other games have done a job with it that you think could be done better or differently, and then find ways to translate those to the medium specifically.
You mentioned Call of Juarez. Can you comment quickly on the narrator in that compared to Bastion? Is it similar? When you talk about creating mystery to expand the universe, to create more questions and answers, how much of the answer do you need as a dev to create those questions?
Astute. You don't have to answer the question internally. Like, for instance, like all the Elder Scrolls mysteries, internally on the team, we also all didn't agree on like some of the answers to some of the mysteries, which is like okay, right? I know there are dev studios where there is like a hardcore canonical Bible that will be kept, and so if you ever need, like, I mean, not even like Star Wars, right? Like Star Wars has like a lot of canonical control. So like if you're going to make a decision, it has to be vetted against like lore masters and all that stuff. But you can still have a certain level of ambiguity in it if you want. It's just a matter of whether that ambiguity is going to damage your ability to be consistent in terms of how you treat things. I realize that's vague. And it kind of comes down to preference. If in doubt, I would say just answer the question like in very clear terms, but just don't expose that to the player.
I realize that this is kind of like your big picture, wrapping it all up term, but you said that we should strive for authenticity. Can you maybe provide an example of a game that inauthentic in its storytelling?
I will come at it a slightly different way. So I started using the word authenticity very specifically when we were working on Fallout 4. So, Fallout 4 takes place in Boston, and Boston is a city that people who like Boston really like Boston. I like Boston a lot. And when you know a place that well, all right, when you fall in love with a place or you've lived in a place and you start working on a fictional version of it, particularly an open world game, there are things that will feel really important to you that actually are not. And I started using the word authenticity in order to differentiate from the word accuracy. So if you're creating an open world Boston, you could grab like GIS data and recreate every street and every alley perfectly. And there are a couple of reasons why you might not do that. Now, one of them might be like performance, which makes total sense. But the other would be, and this is what I would contend, is that making a perfectly accurate version will feel less authentic. You want to capture the essence of the place and then project that. And that means editing, right? It's just like editing a film. You're not going to have like 40 hours of like a camera on a spot to do a documentary. You're going to edit that down to communicate a message. And so the process of capturing what your version of that place is will make it feel authentic and consistent. Another thing that I to make people uncomfortable, like people that I work with uncomfortable. Making worlds is political, right? Like it is an inherently political act. And it's political because you are going to make decisions about what to include, what to omit, what to expand upon or amplify, and what to subdue. And all of those are political decisions. You can make those choices by accident, or you can make them on purpose. And if you're thoughtful and deliberate about making those in a consistent way, that will also inform a through line of consistency throughout what you're creating. I don't know if that...
No, thank you very much.
Yeah, I sort of want to go back to what you said about ask questions, don't tell answers.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the fact that you leave the imagination up to the player, but sometimes I feel frustrated when I don't know what's going on. And I understand that it's aroused curiosity in the player, what's going on, but at some point I feel like that should be resolved,
Mm-hmm.
towards the end of the game. And what do you say to that?
You can't please everyone all the time. There are people who will respond really well to open mysteries, and there are people who won't. I'm failing to grab an example, which is frustrating because I know there are dozens and dozens and dozens. But like a movie that shows the monster versus a movie that holds the monster back. There are people that's just going to be divisive, like the car ride home. There's just going to be people who just like hate the fact they saw the monster when their head was so much scarier or cooler, and like the other person who just wanted to know what the Babadook was got to see what the it's just like it's an artistic choice that you get to make as a creator, but by making that choice, you will alienate some people and you will include other people. For what it's worth, I think when you're making something broad, like an open world game, for example, but not even an open world game, like anything that has a broad fiction, it could be like an indie project, there are things that will demand resolution more than others, right? Like I don't know how many people I've met or read about or talked to like on the internet who like really, really, really hated that Bothans were like unexplained. But like the fiction of Darth Vader demanded explanation, right? Demanded some answers. So I think it's going to come down to your choice as a creator, but there are ways that you can try and like have your cake and eat it too. But if you're trying to please everybody all the time, you're going to end up whitewashing like your message. Right here?
So I'm curious, you you said level building and world creation still has room to grow, and I'm curious, especially for VR, if you think that's like the next step, or if it's more like a little gimmicky sort of enhancement.
Neither. I don't think it's the next step, but I don't think it's a gimmick. So VR is like, it's yet another way for us to provide people experiences, right? So I think that is wonderful. I also don't think that when the iPhone came out, we stopped making consoles. So like VR is just another form of expression for players to create. And I think VR, so VR for level designers, there's a talk by a guy by the name of Lee Perry. And Lee Perry is he's like the lead designer of the original Gears of War. He's done a bunch of stuff. He's gone and done indie stuff now. Lee gave us a very short talk, maybe 1 or 2 years ago at GDC, about like VR and level designers. And he's like, this is our jam, man. This is like, VR is all about spatial, like your relationship with space and scale. And one of the super interesting things, like VR is like, man, there are a lot of people making VR stuff and not a lot of people owning VR stuff, which makes me super anxious as a game developer. But one of the cool things about so many people making VR stuff in the game space right now is we've extremely rapidly, like in the course of like since whatever, like the Oculus Kickstarter, and people started like going, oh man, and we saw a whole bunch of like, you know, super immersive like walk around to space. We saw a bunch of super immersive fly around in a cockpit, and like now we're already seeing like things like, okay, well, what is like a 2D platformer like in a VR game, or like what is, you know, like those flight landing games that like were really popular on touch devices for a year. Like what's one of those like if I do it in a VR space, and like things are like at a miniature scale. Like I think that's really interesting because VR and environmental creation are sort of like fundamentally forcing each other to become different. I just, you know, I hope it's not a gimmick. I hope it doesn't just go away. But I don't think it's also going to eliminate or force like an evolution in other forms of level design. I think you've been raising it for a little bit.
I kind of wanted to stay on the topic of VR, if you're okay with that for a second. So with like the Vive and the Oculus, there's like a bit of a difference there in terms of how much freedom we're giving to the player and how much, you know, the camera they can move around with.
Yeah.
One of the problems that I can commonly see with when you're creating an environment with the Vive is that players can commonly stick their heads through things or you know, mess around with the environment in ways that weren't intended. So something that somebody once told me was that when we're creating with that kind of technology, we need to rely on the player kind of investing, and that's just going to happen. And I was wondering what you kind of say to that. Is that like a symptom of like it's just an excuse for bad level design or something else?
So I think whoever you're talking to is a smart guy or gal. So okay, here's a like a ideology that I have. React to problems that when they're demonstrated, not when they're imagined. Okay, and game developers are really smart and they're really thorough. And so a lot of game developers will get into what's called edge casing, right? Like if you're an engineer, you probably know edge casing is like, well, if the player does and like 85 things, like and now like 1% of my players may encounter this bug, and so I'm going to solve that bug through my design, through like, you know. And if you're solving this with elegant design, that's great. And if you're solving this with Frankenstein code, that's bad. And I don't want to like diminish edge cases, right? Like if you're making a game that's going to ship to like 15 million people, 1% is not, right? Like that's still a lot of people. But when it comes to presupposing and like answering hypothetical questions, you can get into a lot of trouble. And I think a lot of VR devs, through the choices, like through the designs of different demos and different games that I've played in VR, are trying to anticipate exactly those problems and like have a clever solution. So have you played Budget Cuts? Okay, so Budget Cuts it's just a demo. You can find it, it's on Vive, so it's literally called Budget Cuts, the Extreme Premature Demo Edition. Like you can tell somebody at Steam was like, no, you really have to put this up, it's great. And like, no, we don't want to, right? Like Budget Cuts is like my favorite thing on the Vive right now. And part of the reason, like, first of all, it's like a very good, like, sort of like, it's a traditional, like, level design. Like, you go to the thing, and there's like an encounter. It's like this stealth game where you sneak around, and they're like robot guards who go on patrols, and you like kind of hide and throw knives, and you can teleport around the environment. Now, when I was, well, okay, I won't say where I was because I probably shouldn't. I was at a place, and we had a Vive demo running, and so I I was just like helping people out, and it's like, okay, like I know how the Vive works and I can troubleshoot it, so I will like put the headset on you and sort of, like we'll spend some time in Tilt Brush and then like we'll play another thing. And I would put people in front of budget cuts and a few other things because I really enjoyed watching how people experience these things. And the thing with budget cuts is it doesn't handle the head protruding your head through the environment. So like I played the demo, like a dozen times, and I got to a point where like, oh yeah, when this elevator's coming down, I can actually like lean through the wall and like I can see behind the geometry and like shoot my teleporter up and like, get in the elevator and shave like 3 seconds off this thing that I don't want to sit through again. I never saw anybody else do that. Not just that, but people who were playing it, and even people who had played it like 3 or 4 or 5 times, they were so respectful of the game's dimensions. So, Vive is like room scale and like, so in the virtual environment, the player would like be standing here and there'd be a wall like here. Now, of course, I could just walk through the wall, no problem. But people aren't like thinking of that. And then there'll be like a vent. And the idea, like the level design of the experience would be like, grab the vent with your controllers, throw the vent down, shoot your teleporter through the vent, and then poof, and like you're here. People would actually like get down like this and stick their head through the vent and like carefully like place, like surgery just to make sure they didn't like bump their head on the side of the thing. And I would ask people about that, like, hey, when you did that, and like, this is intuitive. Like, and a few people even were like level designers particularly, like, well, yeah, I knew I could probably like stick my head through geometry, but I didn't want to do it. So I think the idea of like players will need to invest is true. Now it doesn't, like I think that if VR maintains and becomes a place where we have a lot of smart people making a lot of stuff for a long time, I think we'll have like elegant industry standard solutions for things like that. But I don't think that the people making VR stuff right now have to pioneer that. Like you want to focus on like the fundamental parts of the experience and not hamstring yourself reacting to things that you just think are going to be problems for everybody. Anyway, that was really long-winded, but hopefully it answered your question.
One last question?
Well, I already pointed to you, so you get it.
Quite a while ago, when you first started the talk on world building, you mentioned rules and that they should sort of guide your world building and sort of the fiction of the world. Mm-hmm. Could you give some examples of rules for maybe Fallout 3 and how you crafted those rules or how they guided the building of it? Or any of the series?
Sure. Okay, I'll give you two quickies, I guess. Transistors and water. All right. So transistors are part of the canonical, like it's from Fallout 1. That culture never invented transistors, and part of that is like, so that influences why like you see like big tube things like the interface in Fallout 1 and 2 like are engineered in a way that like in a world without transistors that still gets like really advanced technology. How is their technology different? Like by making this one butterfly effect change. And then one of the things too that like, and this is an argument I had many times with people working on 3 and 4, is like that transistor, that decision about the world, right? That rule isn't just about like the mechanics of how do I build like a fusion car without a transistor or whatever, but what does that say about the cultural priorities of the people who live in that world? So, for instance, one of the things about like the setting of Fallout for me is like miniaturization of technologies. It's not a priority, right? Like like for us, miniaturizing is really important, but like people kind of forget. Like it's a common thing that people who just play Fallout lightly don't realize is, oh yeah, like technology stopped in the 50s. Like no, actually, technology didn't stop in the 50s. It like evolved beyond what we can do right now. And like there's a lot of super sci-fi stuff in there, but just the expression of it is different. So like the argument I would get into with people is like about security cameras, right? And like level design, rebuilding space and put like CCTV cameras like all around the building and everything. And like, oh, I'm gonna script. And it's like, no. Like there's somebody's house, right? Like in the world of Fallout, a miniaturized camera, like they exist, but it would cost like $15 million. Like I could go to Best Buy and buy one for 15 or 150 for like a whole house setup of like miniaturized cameras. But in their world, like a camera that's miniaturized to that extent would be extremely exotic technology that would only be used like in a super high grade like military complex or by government applications. And again, like for somebody who's like coming into that canon and be like, oh, I'm gonna make a thing and I've done levels before and I use canon, like no. Like, so you have like these rules about the world and like that thing about that camera is like, man, I got so tired of that argument because I knew I sound like a crazy person every time, right? But it's like, it's just this little thing, it's like why the bottles are not, like why aluminum bottles are not the primary bottles. It's like an expression of that world. Yeah, and then like more game mechanic rules. So water is like a big theme in Fallout 1, and then becomes a big theme again in Fallout 3 with like the purification project and all that stuff. And that's why like now like water drinking becomes like this mechanic, right? Like when Emil, I think I contribute this to Emil, when he was creating the rule set of the world and like the core mechanics, like water was always like very early something that was going to be a game mechanic. And then like, okay, well radiation is a thing too, so we're going to like do this risk reward of like how much radiation, which is like, you know, water is an instant health benefit, but then radiation is a long-term like detriment, and you like decide and you're like ratio mathing like, okay, the water in that sink is like super irradiated, but the water in that toilet is like pretty clean because the plumbing goes deeper underground. So I guess I'm drinking from a toilet, right? Like that is like that was a deliberate choice about Fallout 3 specifically, and then like the world rules of that and why things were a certain way, so that we had good cohesion between game mechanics and setting themes.
Great. Well, let's give Joel one more hand.